Jeremy Carl, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on, Kim.
So, this is going to be an interesting conversation. I'm curious, whenever anybody sees a book like this, The Unprotected Class How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart, a title like this is very provocative. This makes people think that, you know, I'm sure you probably are called a racist for writing this book. I mean, the book's not out yet. It's coming out
Yeah.
soon. So have you been attacked? And then
Well,
we'll get into what this is
I'm
about.
expecting that, and I was in the Trump administration, and I've written a lot of controversial things in the past. I was doing things that didn't have anything to do with race at all. They had to do with some of my other kind of academic expertise in environment and resources, and yet I kind of got attacked for things that I've written in this area. And again, these weren't like secret things or things that I didn't probably put my name to, but I think this kind of comes with the territory of writing a book like this, that you're gonna get called names by your adversaries. And it's actually interesting. You kind of mentioned this is a provocative title. This was the less provocative title. I had actually wanted to call it "It's Okay to Be White," and I had the editors. I actually got behind that, and then the sales staff of the publisher were like, we can't sell that title into Walmart and Costco. There's just no way. But I actually think that was
Oh,
indicative, because there's some history behind that statement for those of your audience who's a little more online, and it was kind of used by 4chan to troll the world. And I kind of talk about this a little bit in the book. And so that history is there. But of course, the whole point is, I think the fact that that statement is so provocative actually kind of is a demonstration of the point I'm trying to make in this book, is that, of course, it's okay to be Asian, it's okay to be Black, it's okay to be Hispanic, it's also okay to be white. But if I say it's okay to be white, I mean, that's seen as white supremacy. And so I think that
yeah.
really kind of shows where at least some hidden racial privilege is going on in our discussion. So I've accepted, of course, the left is going to yell about it, but I've tried to write what is actually a serious book, not to sort of throw gasoline on the fire just for the sake of doing that, despite the kind of provocative title. And I hope that people will take it seriously.
Yeah, I was curious if people called you a white supremacist for writing this type of book, because this is a subject that, you're right, you can be anything. It's okay to be anything. We've had protection for many different groups of people, but being white is, especially recently, has been like shameful. Like, oh, you're what? People will apologize. I mean, I live in Los Angeles, so of course, there's going to be
Yeah.
people that I run into every so often that will literally apologize for being white.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a phenomenon that's happened over the last, even my own family on the white side of my family, they had, I mean, how long would you say that this phenomenon of really the anti-white sort of sentiments, when do you think that started? Do you think that started around Trump?
Well, it's interesting. So, I mean, it's interesting because we're recording this. I don't even know if you happened to see yet, but they just announced O.J. Simpson died about an hour ago,
Oh,
and
he
that
did.
kind of he did, yeah. And so that this is what happens when you get off of X for an hour, Kim. You miss these sorts of
I
things.
know,
But
right?
but I mean, in some ways, I kind of tweeted out, and it was going a little bit viral when I last checked, that this was kind of the moment that I felt like everything sort of began to come apart in terms of a consensus reality in America. I mean, if you lived through that, truly, I mean, I wasn't alive for the moon landing, but that's like, it was the kind of media event of the century, and I don't even think we could
Oh
replicate this
yeah.
in the current media environment. Um,
You're talking about
but
the O.J. Simpson chase?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just
I do
like,
remember watching it.
there was nothing like it, and I remember where I was
And the
when they read the
trial,
verdict.
I remember, I was in school when the verdict was read, and they
Yeah,
allowed us to all like gather together in the assembly hall, like,
yeah,
to hear the verdict being read,
yeah,
like it was some sort of school event, and
yeah.
and
No, I
then
mean,
when
it
it
was
was not guilty,
unbelievable.
everybody cheered.
But I think
Yeah.
that, to answer your question, and I do talk about this in The Unprotected Class, there's a real break in 2013. right around then, and some people have called it online the Great Awakening, which is kind of a play on words of this idea of the Great Awakening, these previous religious revivals that we've had periodically in the United States. And in 2013, when you look at the social science survey data, you begin to see this just total radicalization, particularly among the white leftists, not exclusively, but particularly among white leftists.
Uh-huh.
Typically, if you survey people in various demographic groups, they have a preference for their in-group. So if you're Black, you have a slight preference for Blacks, Asian, slight preference for Asian, white, slight preference for whites. And you see this in the survey data throughout every group. And this is not even, I mean, as long as it doesn't get completely out of control, this is not surprising or disturbing that people feel more affinity for a group that they themselves belong to. Except in recent years, among liberal whites, they have an anti-white preference. So they dislike other white people
Mhm.
intentionally. They think they're more criminal. They think they're stupider. You pretty much name it. You go down the list of horribles, and liberal white people who have a huge amount of power in our society have this incredibly contemptuous view of other white people. And I don't know that we even have a great answer. Maybe it was Obama's second term and he begins to speak more frankly. I think that could be part of it.
Right.
But
I mean, I noticed it after I mean, to me, it seems like it kind of really ramped up after Trump. And what I was saying is that, even in my own family, they would come to me and ask me questions like, "Oh, I didn't know," because I'm like the only, growing up, I was the only person that wasn't full. I'm half white,
right,
half Asian, and so everybody in my family on my dad's side is white. And they would, and only recently they would say things like, "Oh, I didn't realize life was so hard for
right,
you. I didn't realize, I never noticed that."
right,
Things were really tough, and I would be like, it wasn't.
mhm,
I don't know what you're talking. I mean, for me, growing up in Idaho, which is like a predominantly white place,
yeah,
being one of the few people that wasn't white in Idaho, I did not feel I wasn't ever made to feel any differently, and neither did I had a best friend who was Black, and she was the only Black girl in our school, in our entire very large school,
yeah,
and I think all of us would say we didn't feel the things that many are trying to tell us that we felt.
sure, of course,
Like telling us, "This is what you did feel."
right,
And it's like, "No, I didn't actually feel that." But anyway, it's interesting that now people start to apologize. This is kind of like a new thing
yeah,
where they're apologizing. And one other thing about people kind of tending to be with their own, that is here in LA, there's a big conversation about well, I guess amongst all liberals, there's kind of a conversation about desegregating Los Angeles or desegregating these big cities,
right,
right? That they're highly segregated because you'll find Black neighborhoods, Asian neighborhoods,
right,
white neighborhoods, right? Jewish neighborhoods. You see all these
right.
different neighborhoods. But look, my family lives in Little Saigon. They want to live
Little
in Little
Saigon, of
Saigon.
course,
They don't have to live in Little Saigon.
right,
They choose to because they want to be around each other, eating the food that they're familiar with, speaking the language that they're familiar with, the customs that they're familiar with. So they gravitated. Nobody forced them into that,
right. You're exactly right,
to your point.
Kim. And this is not and shouldn't be treated as a crime. I mean, of course, we're also going to have areas that are much more mixed, and that's also great. But sometimes people
Yeah.
like living around cultures and other things that we're familiar with. I talk about this in the book in my chapter on kind of real estate and living patterns. I also kind of address directly this idea, and in fact, we saw this in the Bay Area. There was a bunch of kind of these very tendentious academic papers that came out, and they said, "Oh, there's this segregated white wealth, in the Bay Area." Now, this is true to a degree, but it totally ignored these very wealthy Asian enclaves that exist in the Bay Area. It was like they didn't exist. It was
Mhm.
really just the research was there to bash kind of like where white people were. But when you had a totally similar phenomenon in a place that was an Asian enclave, it didn't even get remarked upon.
Okay, so you say that the anti-white racism has grown rapidly, and this is the dominant form of racism in America
Yeah.
today.
And
So you think that racism against white people is now more dominant than even racism against Black people?
Yeah, I do. And by that I mean and I mean if that feels too provocative perhaps, although I would certainly argue that it's accurate, I would say discrimination, right? Like so white people are going to be discriminated against in hiring. They're going to be discriminated against in universities. We just had this affirmative action case in the Supreme Court we can talk about the kind of depth of that, and obviously Asian Americans implicated in that particular story as well. And in fact, that's one of the things I talk about in the book, is there's sort of two different types of anti-white racism and discrimination that are going on. Some of them are simply attempts that I think are very bad, to be clear, to level
Mhm.
the racial playing field in a variety of ways, determined by the people who are making that particular kind of policy. And those are things that just kind of hit whites incidentally. They hit also Asian Americans a lot, especially depending on the group of Asian Americans you're talking about. Now, the predominant group, because it's a much larger group than Asian Americans that's affected by those, happens to be white, but that's just a kind of
Mhm.
numbers game. Then there's a second type of policy that really is directly going after white Americans, where people are being told, you must be BIPOC to apply for this thing or to get this job, or
Right.
let's interrogate your systemic
Right.
racism. So those are two different phenomena, but they're equally damaging.
I would say that I agree that there is systemic racism against white people now. I don't know if I'm using these words right. I think
Yeah.
systemic is when it's like baked into the actual system,
Sure.
right? Is
Yeah.
that what that is?
Yeah.
And then what's the other type of is there like a hidden
Well,
racism, an
there would be sort of
underlying like
personal
a
racism that's removed from
right?
a system. And it's actually
Okay.
interesting.
Well, I agree that whites, I think right now in today's world are seeing systemic racism baked into institutions, right?
Yeah.
Because we're seeing these, we need X number of non-white people.
Right.
We're not going to hire, we want diversity, so we're
Right.
only going to hire white people. We're seeing this in Hollywood
Right.
where they're casting and purposefully. This isn't because of, oh, this person was better for the job.
Sure.
It's purposeful, saying we want to mix up things. That's like affirmative action would be like systemic
Right.
racism against white people, I suppose,
Yeah,
right?
that's the other end of
Um,
that coin.
but I still think that there's more personal racism against people of color than against white people, for sure. I mean, I think that in a powerful society, in a society like ours, where whites do have the majority of the power, because for one, because whites are a majority,
Yeah.
so they're going to hold majority jobs, right,
Yeah.
in powerful positions. When they hire, just going through the hiring process, I think when they're looking at resumes, they tend to, if there's like a funny name, they're like, I don't know about this. I don't want, I can tell this person's black. I can tell this person's Indian. I can tell this person's Chinese. I don't want them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, for individuals, and this is one of the things I make pains to say this in the book. I'm not suggesting in any way that there are not other forms of racism, anti-minority racism of all types, that are going on in the United
Yeah.
States, nor am I trying to whitewash American history, okay, where we've had lots of anti-minority racism. I think the thing you're talking about, I'm sure it certainly exists in some fora. I think there's other times where there's probably unconscious bias going on with somebody who's hiring, and they don't realize that they're favoring somebody who's more like them, but they just do that. So again, I'm not whitewashing it, but one of the things I talk about in the book is a lot of these advantages, or so-called advantages, that white Americans have are very informal, and the sorts of the sort of advantages that we have as white people are kind of informal. They're evanescent. They're going to go away. Whereas the sort of discrimination that they're seeing is very formal. It's very permanent, and it's baked into law, or at least baked into policy increasingly.
Right. So it's more into policy. Then right, the like wanting affirmative action, wanting to have diversity. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah, I mean, the diversity is kind of the name of the game in all of these institutions, and also you're going to have differential achievement because groups have differential interests, abilities, areas that they're going to go for any type of group, right? So it's inevitable that you're never going to have this sort of perfect racial balancing where every single elite grouping is going to automatically match the percentage in society. I mean, for example, Jewish Americans are 2% of the American public and like 30% of American billionaires, right? It's not because we have
yeah.
some huge pro-Jewish conspiracy within elites. It's just, that's where they've tended to congregate and been interested and done very well and worked very hard. So, I'm very wary of these things that attempt to look at any statistical disparity in achievement for any group and say, well, this is just because you're being favored in some way.
Yeah. And then we have to balance it out.
Right.
That's the conclusion, right?
Yeah.
The conclusion is this: you're being favored in some way. You've dominated this certain particular industry. Now we need to balance it out. We need to put other people in these spots. Do you think that there was a time when it was worthwhile to have things like affirmative action?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting point that I kind of talk about a lot in my book. I'm not interested. I think there's a lot of things, and I talk about this in my book, that there were a lot of very significant flaws. A lot of this has come out of civil rights law, I argue. And I've argued that we need to pretty fundamentally change civil rights law. At the same time, I don't think it's either strategically useful or necessarily intellectually the best use of time to kind of try to relitigate the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I think it was responding to some very real societal discrimination, some very real problems. It addressed those problems. It was a blunt instrument to do so, but maybe that's what you needed, at least at that time, to kind of get over some discriminatory structures that were in society. I think the problem is that was 60 years ago. We are as far away from that time today as they were from the Wright brothers. And there's just a lot of different things that have gone on in the 60 years since. There's also been a lot of abuses of the civil rights framework. So if you go back and you read the debates in Congress that were going on around the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a lot of the opponents were expressing concern that X or Y or Z could happen. And the proponents were saying, oh, no, that would never happen. It would clearly be illegal. It would be terrible. And sure enough, once it gets into the bureaucracy, that very thing that they said, oh, this can't happen. In fact, we're explicitly saying it shouldn't. They just did it anyway. And so I think that's been some of the challenge.
I mean, I could see where, especially after desegregation, there was a need for some sort of, blunt instrument that is going to mix society up.
Right.
Even though if you legally desegregate, you're still going to end up with people who are not going to desegregate, right? They're not going to, they're going to just by behavior remain segregated. And so in order to fix that to right that very, very wrong event that happened with segregation and slavery and whatnot, I do think that there probably was a need to force a mixing in society in some way and force the ability for people to have opportunities that they otherwise would be rejected from because of racism that has been bred into society, because that's how people were literally raised at that time.
Right.
So maybe there was a time for it.